ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode 232, and next week is a route review. So, if you have not contacted me over Skype and you want me to review your route next week, do that. Bombs321. And anyways, we should move on then to the question this week. So, that is a question by Tristan's Trains about previously deferred maintenance, and the actual wording of the question is this: I'm sure that right after the apocalypse that most stuff didn't really change, but after a few years of deferred maintenance to track bridges, tunnels, etc., there were some problems. Did you ever run into these with the Zombie Train? Thanks, Tristan. So, that's actually a really good question, because hell yes, we did. And not even, and I wrote down previously deferred maintenance, which isn't really the spirit of the question. It was the stuff that deteriorated after the Great Panic. But really, when you look at when you look at the amount of time that we were out there, which wasn't all that long, there were only a couple of years in between the Great Panic and the establishment of the Zombie Train Incorporated. There wasn't all that much time for stuff to fall apart on its own. There were a few things that did break down during that time scale, but most of the damage actually occurred either before the Great Panic because of deferred maintenance, or during the Great Panic because it was the Great Panic and things got broken. So, yes, a great many things were not in the position to be holding up, but things definitely got worse. Now, the best example of this, there were a few examples of this actually. There's a railroad tunnel in Washington, D.C., and there was severe flooding, I think maybe a year after the Great Panic, and it was bad enough that parts of the tunnel began to collapse because it had not been properly maintained beforehand. Also, some road tunnels, which during the Great Panic, basically turned into parking lots and pile-ups, etc., they became severely damaged by fires. Now, something that's interesting is that the power grid, and I've talked about this before, the power grid managed to sort of keep up with demand, and there wasn't much demand. That's why, the couple of places that could operate on their own, a few places that did operate on their own, like nuclear plants and hydroelectric plants, especially hydroelectric plants, because they don't need any human intervention whatsoever. They'll just keep running. But the power grid doesn't. Lots of power plants rather can basically run on their own for at least a week or so, maybe longer, without any human intervention whatsoever. And some, like I said, will run much, much longer than that. All of the passive power plants, like dams or wind power or solar power, they did very well to sort of keep producing even though there weren't as many people consuming. But the power grid did suffer a little bit. You would have trees taking out power lines and things like that. The average stuff that would happen during a storm, but there was nobody around to fix them, and most of the time there wasn't even anybody around to realize it had happened. So that, being able to tap into available power became a problem, and that's something that we had to put a lot of effort into while, once we started the Zombie Train Incorporated, just getting that back. Now, tracks as well. Tracks, you leave them alone for a few years and they'll get kind of rough. For the most part, it doesn't matter too much, especially if you were dealing with well-maintained tracks before. But some of the back ways we had to take, some of the branch lines, they were getting to the point where the ties were rotting away and the rail was kind of sinking into the dirt because the gravel ballast was long gone before we started running on them. And so we got to them and we had to do a lot of shoring up from time to time. Wow, I'm not good today. I'm yawning all over the place. Even on the major routes that we did use, we'd have to go through them and pay attention. the biggest problem wasn't the maintenance necessarily sometimes, it was more of stuff being left out, stuff being in the way, switches not being thrown back because of the Great Panic, and many people trying to take off in locomotives and not getting very far. There were plenty of tracks damaged because of stuff like that, because of that kind of shenanigans. That said, switches locking up, things rusting out, certain bridges that were on the cusp became fairly dangerous, but it wasn't that much of a problem. You'd think stuff would just start falling apart, but in the grand scheme of things, leaving it alone for only a couple of years doesn't do all that much. On the other hand, people hold up inside tunnels. They were problematic. Sometimes, you didn't want to run somebody over, but you didn't know if what was inside the tunnel was human or formerly human. Most of the time, you don't just want to barrel through, even if you're on the run or whatever. It's kind of tricky. It's a tricky thing. But generally, we'd just make a lot of noise when we were heading in, and even though that could screw us up a little bit, it was for the benefit of the people in the tunnel. Most people don't expect trains, and so you would see in some places ties being pulled out for firewood, and that was always a weird one that we wouldn't see particularly often. But when we did see it, it was a particular pain. Ties being pulled out for firewood, spikes being pulled out, rail being repurposed. Although there's not too much you can use that kind of stuff for, and that was admittedly fairly rare, but it did happen. The bridges obviously got used by people, but in some cases bridges got purposefully destroyed because people wanted to cordon off an area. People living in boxcars or in train yards or whatever. I'm trying to think. Roads actually suffered pretty badly from a few years of no maintenance. People not filling in, people never going around to fill in the potholes. That's what really screwed up a lot of travel. Although it wasn't so bad, it wasn't undrivable, of course, because it's not like we did that much driving, but we did have a Jeep, so it sort of didn't care. But there were some places that were tricky. And as well, the fact that there had been a lot of places where cars had basically just piled up, stopped, blocked the whole road, blocked railroad crossings even. That was a tricky one. And then the other thing that, and this goes with stuff on the tracks, is signaling systems weren't working, and dispatchers weren't there, obviously. And so most of the time, the first time over a line, we had to be extremely cautious for anything, for vehicles, for trains, for bad track, bad bridges, collapsed tunnels. There were some fairly rough weather patterns. There was actually a global cooling effect due to everyone lighting campfires right after the Great Panic, everyone escaping to the north and then lighting campfires. So there were some pretty harsh winters in there, and that did some damage as well. Some houses where the roofs had fallen in, other railroad-related buildings in some cases that had roofs falling in. All things considered, it wasn't too bad, but there wasn't a lot of... you always had to be careful. Like I said, especially on the backwoods branch lines and the detours, the secondary routes, or even, in some cases, we did a lot of traveling down actually abandoned right-of-ways to bypass something else that was a problem, or just to see a different area where we figured there could be something useful or someone needed us in that direction. So, there was a lot of tricky stuff like that. Another problem was drawbridges. Now, drawbridges on their own are generally fairly tricky sons of guns, but if one is swung open, and it's an old one, it might not close again. And we came across a handful of those, especially bridges which are attached to lines which don't get used very often, which most of the time are left open, and then only close when a train shows up. That was problematic, because we would get to them and we either wouldn't have power to be able to close them, or even if we had power, we couldn't get over to them, or if we could do either of those two things, they just wouldn't close, and they actually needed work to get them to close. One of these, which was not our fault, that it was not our fault that it was open, was, again, in DC. DC kind of suffered in terms of infrastructure. But in there's a bridge from like 1904 or something, which is a fairly significant bridge. And it was already suffering in terms of maintenance. So when we showed up on the scene, we had to be very, very careful with it. I don't think... Is it a swing bridge? I don't remember. Hold on. Railroad Bridge, Washington, D.C. Crossings of the Potomac River. Yeah. So, swing bridge, I think. I think it's the one I'm looking at. I'm not getting good pictures of it. At any rate, it's, yeah, long bridge. And that's a son of a gun, as well as the bridges that are along the south coast of Connecticut. Although we didn't go that way very often because we had to do the Selkirk Hurdle anyways, so we would head up, basically use the Boston and Albany to cross Massachusetts, cross the Hudson at Selkirk, and then head down the other side, instead of skirting along the bottom of Connecticut. But that's good track down there. We always knew that would be available for us to use if worse came to worse, which it sometimes did. Flooding up around Springfield and stuff like that would sometimes drive us to use a different route. But when there was particularly bad weather, that we had some ice flows that knocked out bridges along that route. Just because, like I said, the winter was so bad. I don't know, that did a number. That did a number on a lot of things. We had railroad crossings that basically we just had to scoot across using the flangeways, because ice had gotten in there and frozen and deformed the rails and cracked the road up. They are real bastards. Railroad crossings are real bastards in terms of maintenance. And then certain switches that wouldn't throw, like I think I already brought that up. It basically just took a heavy hand to a lot of things to get railroads runnable, just once in one direction. Because, yes, we did encounter trouble. And there are probably some instances that I could come up with if I wanted to look over a map or something and you know, really think about, oh, did this cause problems? Did this cause problems? Mostly drawbridges, though. Those were, I don't know why that didn't come to me sooner, but those were probably the biggest problems. Just in terms of getting from point A to point B. They were not properly maintained. They cost a lot of money to maintain. And they'd be swung open or partially swung open or whatever by somebody trying to escape on their boat. That's, people tried to get out to sea and stuff like that. And so they would basically jump on the bridge and try to get the darn thing open. They'd get it open part of the way, enough for them to get through, and then they'd leave it like that. And then a year later, when we come through, the bridge has been sitting like this for a while. And if it's not supposed to sit like that, especially, some bridges shouldn't be half swung and left like that. You can't swing it back to its original position without doing some serious work on it. So, anyways, Yeah, they definitely came to bite us. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week, Trainman out.